lecture series is part of the HafenCity lecture, which is generously financed and initiated by the HafenCity GmbH. Uns Berntek will talk in a minute. And this time it's organized and conceptualized by Lisa Kosok, Kerstin Niemann, and me, Katrin Wildner. And we are supported by student assistant Melchior Buchholz, Rosa Brombacher, and Maya Lee Vogt. Thank you very much for your support. Before I give a brief summary of what we did last week in our last session, let me welcome today's guests. Valentin Groebner, Cesar Peña from Bogota, Stephen Thije from Brussels, now Eindhoven, and Irena Bauman from Leeds. They will be introduced a little bit later by Hilke Berger, who is moderating this panel session. Now I give the word to Boris Berntek, who is a chairman since 2003 of the HafenCity GmbH Hamburg. Please.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it's a pleasure to welcome you from my side from HafenCity Hamburg GmbH, which is a sponsor of this small program, which has been lasting quite a number of years now, where we are letting HafenCity University experiment a little bit with the way how to disseminate, to discuss issues which are of relevance. Looking a little bit into the past, many years ago we discussed, for example, down-to-earth issues of the other side of the river and how the Olympics got on. And I just mentioned that we had Olympic planning on the other side, and in the evening the critical discussions about Olympics finance by HafenCity Hamburg GmbH, which made me not one of the most liked person in the city administration. But nevertheless, our understanding has all the time been that we need a critical dialogue beyond the teaching issues, sometimes also beyond the research issues. All of you know that research is in some ways produces a limited amount of counter-response and reading among a small group of active researchers, yes, but also into the general public, in the intellectual role of a university, not the functional role of creating actually knowledge output in terms of economic benefit. I think is an important role which especially university needs to play in the case of development of a city of this kind in Hamburg. And it is a very specific privilege to have a university in HafenCity. Yeah? But on the other hand, I think it is maybe also a privilege for the university to have an own area development around the university. I don't want to say which one came first, but I think it is an intellectual possibility we have. And we never would say, well, it is a process of modernization of the city. But to a certain degree, although historians would probably criticize that idea, we try to reinvent to a certain degree also what the city could be. And a lot of people are looking back into the 19th century and say, well, the mix of uses, the intensity of the interaction of 19th century, late 19th century cities is actually potentially a model. That's not what I think is basically correct. We are looking today not into modernizing a city. We are not looking into maybe a modern city, in my view, of our house tradition, but we have the basic task to actually transform the city. You all know about the discussions, some might say these are ideological discussions about the transformation of cities. We need ecological terms. We're not talking only about climate change, we're talking about biodiversity and a lot of other issues. So actually I find it very interesting, but unfortunately I cannot stay, to learn about, so to say, how you relate the interpretation of modern interpretations of what is happening today to those issues which are becoming actually the new issues which are dominating our thinking. We started out, you mentioned it, I started out in 2003 here. There is a tremendous change in the thinking about the city in these 16, 17 years. And coming from a more unclear idea of urbanity, which could be interpreted in an idea of modernism, we are diverting now into other fields of thinking. And I think with you stepping back a little bit and not basically simply following what we think is a great idea of how making a city future-proof in functional terms is, so to say, a great contribution to HafenCity development, but also to the intellectual discussion among students and teachers and researchers. And I thank you very much, and it's a pleasure for us to be here as a sponsor. Have a very successful evening and a very successful discussion, and I hope you feel it has been a very worthwhile visit to HafenCity University with this small part of the city newly built just around it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you already mentioned some topics we probably will discuss about modernity, modernization. And just to make kind of a common ground, I would like to talk a little, like a couple of minutes about what we did last week. We had, as guests, we had Aleida Assmann, Stefan Trüby, and Katrin Peters, and we tried to create kind of a common grounds through some terms of concepts. Aleida Assmann proposed a temporal classification of the term modern through the centuries, and she marked some characteristics as the constitution of the individual, also the future orientation, and the specific relation towards time. Every time, she said, an epoch or moment is postulated as modern, something preceding is radically cut off. And she invented, I just dropped through this images which were drawn by Johanna Benz, who kind of were documenting the whole session, or commenting maybe even. This is Modernity, that would be like the Modernity, the urban researcher. And here this is what I wanted to show you, like the Vergessensintensität der Moderne, the kind of intensity of to forget, like the very special relation of the modern with time. And I think that was one of the main topics we discussed. Katrin Peters, she emphasized, on the other hand, modernity as a heterogeneous temporality. Referring to global situations, she talked about transcultural history versus an homogeneous national history. And she mentioned kind of specific textures and politics, defining a local, eclectic modern, which is also different. Stefan Trüby, as an architect, looked at the specific materialization and architecture of modernism, and he was questioning very much how an anti-national project based on an emancipatory universalism has become kind of state architecture in the sense of modernization. So he was like really critically looking at modernity and for him, modern architecture is nowadays is kind of reassuring social democratic welfare state. So this would be some topics. So again, the question of temporality, the significance of the present in relation to past and future. Maybe we can have some more looks here. The relation between backwards and towards a new future or another future. The radical breaks, the cut-off of the past, the promise of the future, a future which is activated in the present as well as it is shaping the present. So this was kind of the relation on the different time. Here was like the kind of memory of the future, which is shaped kind of by something very powerful. And there was this idea of folklore of the future. So you see, this was, I think, for me, one of the main topics is different temporalities. And I think, without making much more like comments, future, you could see like we also figured about this 100 year of Bauhaus, what kind of modernity is that, what kind of junction and significance there are, and we wondered about this way, and this might be an aspect of the folklore of the future, also the architecture, tourism. Is there something in it? And I'm very curious now to discuss and to see your case studies, how you would approach this question of on different temporalities, on different locations. I would like to introduce the moderator, Hilke Berger. We could win her for a moderator, which is makes us very happy. She's an urban researcher, studied theater studies, communication and media studies in Leipzig, worked at the HCU for several years in the department where we are all from, in Department of Culture of the Metropolis. And she is in her different works, PhD thesis, but also other publications she did. She's looking at a new culture of cooperation to initiate dialogues on eye level between different stakeholders, initiatives, activists, artists on urban or in urban development projects. So she looks at the interfaces between cultural studies and urban planning. And now, actually, she left the HafenCity University, and currently she's working for Hamburg Authority for Culture and Media, where she's responsible for the connection between urban development, art and culture. So she's really trying to do it in practice, like practicing these ideas, but we are very happy to have you back here, at least for a moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very, very kind introduction, because I don't, it's working, right. Okay, so firstly I wanted to say that I'm really, really happy that we have this very, very international setup here with experts from all over the world, actually. And I think we are going to face at least two challenges today. The first challenge will be that it's very, very hot in Hamburg. It's a heat we are not common here with. I think for all northerners in the room, it's a kind of a challenge to try to think in this kind of heat, because it will feel a bit like work. But on the other hand, I think that gives us maybe a nice surrounding, a nice atmosphere. And the other challenge, I think, will be that I think only a few of us are native English speakers here today, and the translation of the German term Moderne is not that easy, because it comes with different connotations. We have there the term modernity, which is more related to the time. It's a concept of a time period, more or less. And we have the term modernism, which relates more to the aesthetics and the concept of materialization of modernity. So I think these two different connotations of the German term moderne have already given us kind of tools to work with, in this case two terms to work with, and maybe we can keep that in mind for our discussion later on. So I think maybe this will come in handy today, because last week, as Katrin Wildner summarized for us, we focused more on the theoretical concept of the term modernity and all the relations with this term. And today we want to try to take a look at more practical cases and the transition from this theoretical concept to actual case studies. So I think in this slide, the challenge of the language translation maybe brings shines some light on topics we wouldn't address in German. So I think that's pretty good. So let's get down to business, I think. Just a few comments on the procedure today. We're going to start with a brief introduction of all the experts, and then they will also kind of briefly give you a view on the work they're doing, on their perspective on modernity and modernism. And after that, we will have like a really discussion. So this is not supposed to be a closed shop expert interview where I'm conducting interviews with each one of these experts, but you're kindly invited to join in with questions. And I also invite the experts to talk to each other. So I really only want to moderate this thing. So firstly, I welcome Valentin Groebner here. It's very, very a pleasure to have you here. Valentin Groebner came here from Switzerland. He holds a chair at the University in Lucerne as a professor of history with a main focus on the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. He was a fellow and visiting professor in many different countries and institutions, among others at the Department of History and Art at Harvard and the Max Planck Institute for History and Science in Berlin. He has published numerous books about visual culture and memorial history. I hope the term memorial history is the right one here, which is kind of a big question too, but never mind. So his last, or maybe the publication which will be especially of interest for us today, is called Retroland, Geschichtstourismus und die Sehnsucht nach dem Authentischen, so the longing for authenticity. I'm very excited to have you here today and to get to know your perspective on modernism and modernity. And maybe you can answer the question, how much past do we need in the concept of modernity today, and how the promise of modernism is connected to tourism. So, your stage now.
Thank you. It's on? Yeah. I like the idea. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Thanks for making me come here to enter the dialogue. I like the idea that modernity is a kind of heat, a sort of philosophical or ontological hotness, a zone of, or a territory of constant high temperature in which things start to change, to irreversibly to melt, to liquefy, including us at this remarkably warm Hamburg evening. Modernity, like heat, is something we long for. It's something we invest a considerable amount of time and energy to get it, until we're surrounded by it, or even swallowed by it, cooked, and then we long for cooler temperatures, for refreshments, for a nice and very cold drink from the past. The analogy is tempting because, as you know, heat is defined by the speed in which molecules move in a given unit in three-dimensional space. And modernity, as we have to come to use the term, is speed. It is, when modernity is a promise, then it is a promise of acceleration, of even ever higher speed through reduction of frictions of materiality, the promise of efficiency through standardization and control, and by technological and economic measures. And since the rise of oil in the 1890s as the global energy provider, modernity is the promise of cheap energy, lots of cheap energy. Simultaneously, both modernism and modernity are both narratives. Modernity presents itself as the story of the fragmentation and dissolution of the older, more clumsy stuff of social, technical, and economic structures, of their willful destruction in order to enable their recombination in faster, more efficient, and frictionless structures. modernity as a narrative thus allows both all-encompassing fantasies and utopias of the new, and simultaneously a discourse of loss, melancholic feelings about the disappearing also. And in these narratives, modernity presents itself as a highly rational enterprise, as the very embodiment of technic and economic rationality. When we talk about the promise of modernity, we have to start from the observation that modernity itself is always already a promise. First of all, a promise of redemption from material restraints, including the body we have. In order to keep uphold its character as a promise, modernity has to present itself as irrevocable and being proud of it. So this is the baseline. This is written in the small, in the user manual instructions of modernity. There's something written in small writ, for the last 140 years. And there's a little sentence, a statement, like it or not, it's gonna happen anyway. And in most cases, we like it. We like modernity in communication devices, data transfer, high-speed trains, as long as they are not delayed. Whenever we sit down in a dentist's or gynecologist's chair, we appreciate modernity. But seen from a historian's point of view, which is the role I'm taking here today, modernity is not about the future. I would argue that modernity, in spite of all the slogans boasting the opposite, has nothing to do with future developments and events. Modernity is always about the past because it is defined by a special relationship to this past. Let me explain. Modernity, seen from a historian's point of view, is not one or several concepts. It is a rhetorical position, and one that is pretty old. The term modern, modernos, is a 12th century invention. And when scholars began to use the term for discussing the differences between the antiqui, the old authors, and the moderni, the new ones. At a first glance, this has nothing to do with modern achievements like electricity or the combustion engine. But the debate then was mainly about the merits or dangers of Aristotle and Averroes and some other dead Greek and Arab philosophers. But for us, the history of the term holds a lesson. Modernity, however you define or frame the term, is a relational concept. Everything that conceives itself as modern is in desperate need of a push-off point from the past, one or several points of oldness, as it were, against which the new stuff, usually embodied or personified by the speaker, against the new stuff can make its push in order to create the impression of difference and a movement forward. So modernity is in desperate need of the old stuff in order to define itself. And this is what's happening in the last 120, 140 years. That's why an architect or a theoretician like Adolf Loos railed so fanatically against the primitive and the dangerous savage tattooed bodies full of ornaments he wanted to get rid of in order to become modern. Whenever modernity came up in the 1890s, in the 1920s, in the 1930s, as the evocation of some radical new, it was always populated with protagonists and figures and emblems from very remote pasts. And my favorite example for this is my compatriot Sigmund Freud, who for psychoanalysis sort of reinvented and reused very old protagonists like Oedipus, Narcissus, etc., Moses, in order to create a completely new science of psyche. Think of the architects, town planners, at Modernity's cradle, from Peter Behrens on. The same goes for the Bauhaus guys. They all evoked medieval craftsmen, the dome Baumeisters of the 13th and 14th century, as their role models, and their fascist colleagues in the 30s and 40s did the same with other protagonists. Seen from this perspective, modernity is always a narrative in need of a remote, clumsy past. It is a rhetorical tool because it's used in a way that it makes the speaker who uses it so special. It is self-fashioning. While others are still lurking in some murky backward past, we, the moderns, are already grappling with the future, so it goes. With the sleek or fearsome things to come. In 21st century cars, there's a little inscription in the rear mirror, which you might know, and it reads, "Objects in the mirror are closer than they appear." Talking about modernity is gazing in some rear mirror in order to grasp the relations of things that are behind it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valentin Groebner, for this very, very interesting start of our discussion, the first input. And I think we will come back to many things you mentioned. I also kind of heard Alaya Assmann with the things Katrin mentioned, the cutting off of the past to be able to conduct modernity. And the efficiency will be something I think we will talk about. And I myself am very much interested in the narratives who come with modernity, and I think that we will find this too with other experts. So now, next up will be Cesar Peña. I'm very, very, very happy to have you here with us today because he came all the way from Bogota, Colombia to be with us. And he's a professor at the School of Architecture and Design at the Universität de los Andes in Bogota and works in the field of history, critical theory, and design studies. He is an expert for the role of narratives, so we already have kind of a combination there. Narratives around urban aesthetics and embellishment in the configuration of Latin American cityscapes. And in this context of modernity, I think that the role of narratives are key, so I'm looking very forward to hear from your perspective about traditional assumptions about modernity in Latin America. I will go sit there because you're going to show some slides, right? Or
no, I'm not.
Okay, then I will just remain here, but please. Join us.
I think it's yes. Well, thank you. One of the first things I would like to remark about modernity is three terms that I usually use to introduce these discussions to my students, which is modernity, modernism, which is pretty much the same that you were saying in German, but we have to use modernization as well, because that comes in handy to understand especially Latin America, since Latin American history since the 1930s, right? So modernization basically implies the lack of synchronicity between European and North American modernity and Latin American modernization relates to the time in history when this became the dominant discourse on how these countries, the periphery, need to modernize. So this is one of the assumptions around the 1930s, and that doesn't come along. It also comes with a whole bunch of things, political programs, particularly the ISI program. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It stands for industrialization by the substitution of imports, which is basically the program that the Economic Commission for Latin America established to implement modernity in these countries. So that's the first thing to point out, the problematic relationship with this lack of synchronicity between European modernity and North American modernity. But we were always looking at that modernity. Modernity actually stands for speed, acceleration, efficiency, standardization, as you were saying, Valentin. But the problem around the 1930s, 40s, and even nowadays is that many of those adjectives doesn't stand for many of the things that happen actually in many parts of Latin America. So that's another difference or problematic situation. Around the 1930s, a large percent of the population was rural, and it was just basically about 20, 30 years ago that we started having like 70 through 75% of people concentrated in cities. Actually, one of my assumptions is that consumer society, the so-called consumer society, that is something that is supposed to happen in Europe or in the States around in between the 19th and 20th century or 19th century. Doesn't happen, or is happening in several Latin American cities, major cities, around over the past 3 decades or something. We were starting to consolidate and actually feel that we have this kind of consumer society. So at this moment, you should be thinking, so what was modernity in Latin America? What happened to modernity in Latin America? And that's another problem. One of the assumptions, or one of the statements I make, is that for a long time, modernism and modernity was a discourse that was mostly appropriated by the elites. That it was handy to preserve certain privileges. That it was a way to convey certain ideas related to modernity, like hygiene, orthogonality, speed, acceleration. But it didn't spread well. It didn't resonate with the whole population because it was problematic. It was for a long time. But the interesting part is another term Valentin was using that was the rhetorical value of modernity and modernism. Modernism as a rhetorical tool, and that's when architecture comes in interesting. Modernism in the cities I've been studying over the past years, Mexico, Lima, and Bogota, mostly circulated throughout media, discourses, and it was scenified, or it was displayed through actual interventions in the cities, such as the National University in Colombia, for example, and the Universidad Central de Venezuela, or the Central University of Venezuela in Caracas, or the Unidad Habitacional de Alto Tlatelolco and the UNAM, the National Autonomous University in Mexico, or the Simón Bolívar Towers in Venezuela as well. But also, Hollywood imaginary, or Hollywood actors and actresses, and the world fairs vastly circulated mostly in printed media in Latin America. So that's when a lot of problems also come in, because something it's probably not one of the things you mentioned here jump in as a big problem in Latin America, because it implies things about social class, race, and of course gender in several occasions. But mostly, I would say, social class and race. In this use of modernity and modernism as a rhetorical tool, there was an overemphasized role of the architects and urbanists, not only in the conception of the city and shaping the city, but also in the conception of urban life, modern life. They were the ones who had the language, the visual language. They were familiar with the visual grammar of modernity. So they were the ones who were able to draw, basically, and to depict modernity and spread the word about modernity in these countries. So the discourse propagated by a small amount of the population, by the elite, wasn't part of a democratic or the democratization of architecture or urbanism initially. But at some point, especially by some institutions that were in charge of urban embellishment and beautification of the city, lower classes were seen as hurdles that modernity either needed to avoid or indoctrinate. This is when, at least in countries like Peru and Colombia, the difference between the lower and middle class emerged. Lower class reaffirmed in traditional culture, in traditional rural cultural manifestations, whereas most Latin American cities were flooded with peasants after suffering displacement for several reasons. There was actually an international modernism as well. It was a global movement and a global language. It was the lingua franca of citizenship. It was a little bit different, maybe in Mexico, because of the revolution, the 1910 revolution, where an identity built around the popular culture and the native identity, the Mexican, the Azteca identity, it was possible, and also around the revolutionary concepts or the image of the revolution. But in most of the countries, there was a sense of change in the configuration of the idea of modernity. It was also a promise. Modernism was a promise for several people, because it could be a transformative experience or a transformative way of shaping a new life to provide some social mobility, for example. The difference between what I found in several descriptions around that period is that the difference between lower and middle classes were basically cultural. The lower and middle classes had the same income, but the main difference was because the middle class, the so-called middle classes, were familiar with the visual language and the modes of modernity, the fashion of modernity. In this context, aesthetic presents as a power structure, part of a power structure. And I would like to point out the relationship between aesthetics and ideology. In a multi-layered society of Native American Colombian people, colonizers, masters and rulers, colonial hierarchies, modernism was problematic at best. On the one hand, it served the elite to legitimize itself in power and secure certain inherited privileges, but it also allowed to outcast and remarginalize a large portion of the population. Also, in terms of the relationship between aesthetics and ideology, I have also found something coming from international organisms that were running a geopolitical agenda, such as the Pan-American Union. For example, in terms of art and modern art in Latin America, many of the artists that emerged in this period, during this period, were part of the visual arts. I'm sorry, I forgot the name of the office. It was run by Jose Gomez Sicre from the Pan-American Union, later called the Organization of American States. And it was a way to unite the Latin American region around those ideals, but it wasn't, it wasn't joining all people together around the same ideals, but certain elite at the moment that it turned out to make, to emphasize inequality in Latin America. So aesthetic and ideology, it was usually related to, or it was usually used to identify or to stigmatize, in some cases, one ideology or the other. One example that I always talk about is how, for instance, in one of the sessions of an institution called the Society of Embellishment in Bogota, communist posters were seen as a sign of bad taste because they were usually written with errors, with many typos and stuff like that. And also, in some parts in Mexico and Peru and Colombia as well, Americanism and indigenous art were stigmatized because of the same affiliation to communist ideas. There's something else about the discourse, the modern discourse, that it was conflictive with the pre-modern bodies that inhabited the space. And I'm not saying this in a derogatory way. I'm just pointing out the difference between the ideas of modernity that were being depicted in magazines and using usually very famous actors and actresses from Hollywood, and the dissonance or the disconnection with the actual bodies and corporality and embodiment of what Colombia was in the 1930s. Last point I want to bring is the struggle for visibility and persistence. On the one hand is the visibility and the struggle for visibility in the cityscape of many of these cities. And on the other hand, the struggle for making invisible what it didn't fit into the framework of modernity. On the other hand, the persistence of traditional values, of traditional hierarchical powers, and the way it was materialized in different examples in different cities in Latin America as a way to depict the persistence of unresolved problems from the past and the problematic existence of some people in the cityscape. Well, that's basically it. That's basically it.
Thank you very much for this perspective on Latin America. I think that the power structure and the relation to aesthetics and the role of the artist is a great bridge to invite Thije to us on the stage, because he will give us some insight of the actual concept in modern or of modern art. But I think some other topics you mentioned are very interesting for the discussion later on too, because this question of discourse, privilege, elites, and the awareness modernity creates, I think, relates to the thing you said, Valentin, about being proud of something, and this question of authority that comes with this. So, but now, Thije, who came here from the Netherlands, I'm very happy to have you here as well. He works in Eindhoven at the Van Abbe Museum as a curator and of collections. He published also various articles and reviews, among others the essay The Emancipated Museum, and in 2017 you co-curated together with the Museum of American Art the collection presentation The Making of Modern Art. So we are very happy to have you here and looking forward to your input and maybe to answer the question how to exhibit not only modernism but maybe also modernity.
Thank you.
And you're going to show some slides, right?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
I will sit over there.
I
So
can just give it to you, or you want me to?
Like it.
Yeah. So yeah,
Yeah. Thank you very much for the invitation and introduction and all the interesting presentations. So I'm the curator of the collections in the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven, which is a city in the south of the Netherlands. And here I wanted to start with this. Later I thought, of course, in a discussion about architecture and development, I should have shown you the building, but I forgot, so maybe another time or maybe later. But you are already now in the Van Abbe Museum, in the new wing of the museum. The museum was founded in 1936, and you're looking at two maps, and you're looking here at the collection of the Van Abbe Museum. You're looking here at a data infographic designed by the graphic designer Joost Schotens, commissioned by the museum under the supervision of Christiane Bernes, an idea of Lolita Lat, many years ago already. And why is this the collection of the Van Abbe Museum? What you're looking at here is a map of the origin, the place of birth of the artists that are in the collection of the Van Abbe Museum. And so, even if, of course, there are many flaws in this kind of data, because artists, just like any normal human being, move, maybe artists even more than other human beings, but at least you get some idea of, let's say, what's the origin of the collection of the Van Abbe Museum. And then here you're looking at the century map, which is next to that in the hallway of the museum. Here you're looking at the city of Eindhoven. The city of Eindhoven is a city of around 200,000 inhabitants. And here you're looking at the place of origin of those citizens. And just as here, let's say, the darker the map is, the more artists are born in that area. Just here, the more red the map is, the more people are coming from that area. And of course, what you see if you put the two maps together and you think that we are a true city museum, we are a municipal museum, we are paid by the citizens of Eindhoven, all the citizens of Eindhoven that step through my door, I always say, welcome to your art, because we are holding your art for you. But then if I look at, let's say, the inhabitants of Eindhoven today, then I have to admit to them, confess to them that maybe perhaps it's not so representative of who you are today anymore. And that's maybe my introduction on how to approach this question of how to exhibit modernity, because we are a museum founded in 1936 by a local cigar manufacturer, Henry van Abbe, who was then making Karel 1 cigars. And this was part of a, let's say, a traditional Bildungsinitiative, like civilizing mission, trying to bring culture to the uncultivated workers of his factory, but also the Philips Corporation, because Eindhoven is Philips, as you might know. And at that time already, the Van Abbe Museum was maybe more by fate than by choice a museum for modern art. Why? Because we couldn't afford old art. That's the true story of our collection. They wanted old, but they couldn't afford it, so they bought the new. But now we're very happy with the new because we bought very beautiful new art. And what happened after that is that the Van Abbe Museum, well, of course, we opened in 1936, so right before the war. In the war, all things happened, but not so much exhibition making. And after the Second World War, you got kind of the Van Abbe 2.0, where the Van Abbe really started to become a traditional museum for classical modern art, following, in a way, let's say, the line that was developed at that time by, let's say, the Lighthouse Institute to present and exhibit modern art, the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And in the opening year of the Van Abbe Museum, MoMA had commissioned an exhibition, Cubism and Abstract Art, and that exhibition, in a way, rewrote modern art history from, let's say, the now, and did so with a very interesting twist, because European museums are, in a way, born out of nation-state building projects. And so the original 19th century museums often have a very strong emphasis on national schools. Also, the way the collection was exhibited was structured around national schools. And what was so innovative from Alfred Barr, the director of MoMA, and how we presented modern art, is that he said, it's not about countries, it's about movement, it's about, in a way, dynamics, it's about speed. And it's about showing the best examples of that movement internationally. So he started to exhibit Cubism, Expressionism, Impressionism, whatever kind of isms that were not longer bound to the nation state. Van Abbe Museum followed that lead and started to collect art from that principle, and did so very successfully. So that now we hold not a very big collection of 3,000 works, but among those works, very well-sounding names that are requested all over the world. We also did this kind of infographic from our most traveled works, where you can see how, let's say, they travel much more than we do in the museum. And let's say our Irena Dumas has a very interesting life, I can tell you. So the painting of Irena Dumas that we have. So what we did then is we collected that modern art and started to present it. And the interesting thing of the Van Abbe Museum, being located not in the metropolitan area, if I might call it like that, of the Netherlands, which is the Amsterdam, Utrecht, The Hague, Rotterdam, which is all quite close to each other, and also draws a lot of tourism. But Eindhoven, in a way, is outside of this tourist energy. So it has always been quite local in a way, even if for art, let's say art professionals would travel to Eindhoven to see exhibitions there because it had a very good reputation internationally, but it wasn't a tourist destination to say. So let's say 80% of our public also comes from, let's say, this red map, so from the city of Eindhoven and its surroundings. And so what we did in that period, so following the second, let's say the second half of the 20th century, is we presented that modern art to that public, and we educated, let's say, the ever-growing educated part of the public, because it were, let's say, the welfare years of the European society. So we had, let's say, increasing wealth and better education, more art. So our public grew, and so did our, let's say, the interest in the art that we collected. And so we built up, let's say, not a big, but a kind of a devoted public that was very committed to the kind of modern art that we had collected. And while we were doing that, Eindhoven changed into the map that I'm showing you now. So from a city that, in a way, maybe 80% of the population came from the Netherlands and the region around it, it turned into this global city in which now we have ASML, big circuit board manufacturing companies that draw tech, let's say, brains from all over the planet to come and work with us. We have Turkish migrants, we have Moroccan migrants, we have people from the former colonies in Eindhoven. So it's even this provincial town in Eindhoven, in that sense, is a kind of a global city. And so in a way, I would want to introduce a kind of a, let's say, a paradoxical consequence of modernity and modernization in that sense, in that, in a way, through speeding up and connecting and creating relationships between all kinds of communities and peoples in the process of modernization, in the end, let's say, what was first branded as modern culture, namely Western culture, becomes provincialized and becomes problematic. And that is the reality we face today. That in a way we have a collection of modern art for a very, very modern city of Eindhoven, but in a way if we want to talk to that modern city of Eindhoven today, we have to recognize that in a way, let's say, modernity produced a whole different culture and our collection in a way doesn't properly fit to that. How do we do that? What do we do next? For that we collaborated with the Museum of American Art Berlin and with my colleagues Charles Esche and Christiane Bernes and Luce Janssen, and we started to develop a new plan on how to present our collection, and that was called The Making of the Modern Art, Making of Modern Art, which was a title that played with the idea of the making of, as in a documentary, the making of, like the making of the narrative of modern art. And as you can see, it's a very typical white cube exhibition of modern art. No, in a way, it's completely the opposite. We created an environment in which, in a sense, we thought that we needed to alienate our public from their well-known history or tradition of modern art to be able to reconnect to it in a different way. And so we started to approach modern art through this kind of Balkan Oriental room where you see in a way an analog PowerPoint of the history of the Modern Art Museum on the wall. And you're looking at Maria that was from a sculpture from a church very close to Eindhoven, which here hangs next to two Mondriaans, which one of them is the real one, and you can decide for yourself which one's which. And then you can place bets, and I will show you which one's which at the end. No, we started to, in a way, present our collection in a very different way. And the idea was, let's say, based on what I just told, is that we, in a way, wanted to kind of differentiate people from, let's say, their embeddedness within this kind of presumed idea that modern culture had a common face and common appearance, and to explain to our public that this common idea of this, let's say, what we understand is this kind of, let's say, fallback modern culture, in a sense, is the result of a very specific culture and a very specific development, and in that sense needs to be kind of reconfigured. And within that, let's say, we play all kinds of games. So we try to, in a way, tell the story not through the artworks, but through, in a way, the establishment of the institution and the storyline. And we try to also explain, in a way, the kind of rules of the museum that we don't really think about so much anymore when we go into the museum, but which become super visible to us when we rate them. For instance, the introduction of copies into the museum. Because, of course, and that's already been mentioned earlier, authenticity, in a way, modernity is based out of a kind of a, let's say, it's a dual concept that always pushes one thing back and one thing forward. So, copy is bad, the authentic thing is good. The past is bad, the future is good. And so we try to complex, make all these kind of, let's say, traditional assumptions complicated and ask our public to kind of open up to them. There is much more to say about that, but I also realize I'm on a very tight clock, so maybe I keep this as a kind of a teaser introduction and I continue about it later. I think maybe that's better. What I maybe want to end with is that, let me end with one slide. Here you see our founder, Henry van Abbe, on the left, testing tobacco in the tobacco fair in Amsterdam. And at the bottom you see people performing a death dance ritual, which is the mask that is in the vitrine next to it, which is not from the Van Abbe collection, but is from the Tropen Museum, the colonial collection of the Netherlands. And in the middle you see the workers of the tobacco industries in colonial, the Dutch Indies, sorting the tobacco. And one thing that we have become extremely aware of in the last year and that we are trying to work through is that we realize that one of maybe the core duality of concepts that lies at the heart of modernity is the pair, colonial and modernity, also already addressed by the previous speaker. And to show you in what way that kind of blurs our vision, this mask is from 1940, Whereas this painting is from 1909, which is one of our, let's say, landmark Picassos that we own. So in a sense, this is the more modern work in our collection display. But of course, this one is celebrated by our more to be recognized as a great achievement in the history of modern art. And so what we want to do with the collection is in a way also make the complexities of this and also all the assumptions and prejudices that are embedded within modern culture, to make them more visible and to allow also the Eindhoven public to realize that their collection, which they maybe have never associated with the colonial project of the Netherlands, also through the money of Van Abbe, who was a cigar manufacturer using ground material from the colonies to make his fortune, to allow us to have the museum. So that in that sense, I think there is no place untouched by the intricacy, let's say, the dynamics between these two parts of modernity. And that's something that I also like to talk more about in the rest of the discussion, but maybe for now it's the concluding point for this moment. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen Peña, for this very great teaser for things who will come back later too. I think this relation between colonialization and the discussion of post-colonization, post-colonialism and modernity, we addressed that last week too, and I think it's a very important topic we will come back to later on. And I think with this example, it's quite interesting because this question of temporality really becomes obvious, right? Because you have like a representation of the past in the present, who was supposed to give a look into the future, and then you have the question of the audience who was addressed by that. So I think that is a great example to talk about. But now, last but not least, we have Irena Bauman here, who came from the UK. And I think she has at least two professions, because she is the director of Bauman Architects and of a fabrication company called Mass Bespoke. And I think I read it right, they are both located in Leeds in the UK, right? So. And she also worked as a professor for sustainable urbanism at Sheffield University and currently holds the Royal Commission 8051 Fellowship. One publication of hers is for this context especially interesting. It's called Management in Liquid Modern World, and it was conducted together with Sigmund Bauman, and I'm very, very happy here to have you on the stage, and looking very forward to your perspective and maybe of the concept of liquid modernity, how it applies to architecture, and also maybe to the questions what prefabricated 3D models have to do with all this and the promise of modernity. Very warm welcome.
It's very interesting when so many different voices speak in turn, because each time you enter the same subject through a slightly different door. And I'm we've been asked to consider modernism as a promise, and the use and usefulness of it in the face of potential and real disruptions of the new orders. And I would like to make a specific proposition at the end of my presentation, based on my work as an architect who was really brought up in the shadow of modernism. All my teachers were modernists. The movement was still alive and was just beginning to decline. And then I had to spend my entire life of practice in the postmodern world, in liquid modernity. Taught modernity, working in postmodernity. And also now, just over the last 10 years, beginning to learn completely from scratch almost how to address as an architect the issues of climate crisis. So a life of constant movement and reflection. Okay. And how do I move it? Okay. So just to frame my proposition that I want to outline to you, I want to just make a couple of observations. One is that stylistically, modernism, the architectural, physical manifestation, has done extremely well. And it has survived all sorts of changes of fashion. It has conquered very heavily and has set itself across a great variety of cultures and places in the world. We don't need to research very far. Your city, Hamburg, my city, Leeds, we all share similar modern architecture, and this is experience of most cities in the world. And there is a reason for it, to do with modernism. Stripped of its idealistic values, modernism became architecture style of choice for the global corporate office sector. The modernist movement, with its traits of engineering approach to architecture, its idioms of less is more and from form follows function, and its autonomy from all context, be it historical, cultural or environmental, and also its call for international style, they all fit perfectly with the values of those who see social progress as a growth economy and to whom financial markets are the master institution. And these are the elites who are building our cities and who are the keenest to resist the notion of architecture for social good, which was so key to the modernist ideology. So there are two aspects here in architecture. One is the style, the physical manifestation, the other one is the ideology that actually underpins it. And the architectural stylistic shortcomings contributed to the ideological failures of other strands of modernist architecture, often applied to public buildings and housing solutions, such as brutalism. There are many, many different strands in modernism. Brutalism was the one that was applied to housing most of all. Some say that the current ongoing demolition of Robin Hood Gardens estate, which you are seeing here, drawn beautifully by an artist, designed by Allison and Peter Snipson, is the latest heralding of the end of architecture for social good. So the big discussion at the moment is, can architecture pick up the ambition of modernism and address itself to the idea of social good? The failure of architects and architecture to deliver the desired modernist overhaul of social order raised the issue identified by the historian Manfredo Tafuri of the crisis of the ideological function of architecture rather than the crisis of the architecture itself. He ruled out the potential of change for architecture. So Tafuri's conclusion, looking at modernism, was that architecture and architects cannot create change, you can only follow change. However, not everybody agreed, and Frederick Jameson, writing a decade later, suggested that the potential of a Marxist enclave theory of grassroots, marginalized groups working gradually from the fringes of society to forge a position of critical enclave that initiates change. So there is a proposition here that grassroots activism can actually create change. The proposition I want to explore with you is whether we currently have some new conditions in the built environment, namely new digitized building technologies and the rapid growth of new civic institutions, which together could salvage and reunite some of the modernist dreams of industrialized architecture for social good and allow architecture to become a contributing process of change arising from enclaves of grassroots rebellion. So how could that work? There is incredible growth of industrialized means of construction. There are enormous modern methods of construction. They are being heralded by many as transforming the construction industry and the role of architects. We see lots of examples of it just walking around the university area. These methods are an advance on the technologies of modernists in utilizing greater range of materials and expanding mass production from components only, which is how it was during modernism, to the fabrication of whole sections of buildings as well as actually the whole buildings in factory conditions. The factories are centralized and are in private ownership, playing their part in increasingly unequal society. The promoters of modern models of construction are promising speed, productivity and quality, that's familiar, but are not prepared to engage on the issues of social value. So those new construction methods are continuing some of the modernist thinking, but are still ignoring the idealism that underpinned it. However, and this is a disruptive element, over the last few years, new digital technologies have emerged, such as 3D printing and CNC routers, that enable distributed fabrication of new types of digital construction systems, such as Wiki House or Mass Bespoke that we have designed. Buildings can be fabricated on site in small flying temporary factories in very small components that can be handled by 1 or 2 people who do not need to be experts in building. This is very important. Now, these are systems that can be made locally and built locally without a great deal of skill. As the design and fabrication are parametricized in the system, that's another technology. The systems can be affordably modified to fit bespoke needs of the users and of the places. So the first time we have industrialized systems which can be bespoke, that can avoid the terrible stigma of off-site production, which is that there is too much competition and everyone looks the same. So, as these new systems grow, so is the civic response to the multiple current crises, evidenced by the rapid growth of community-led housing, of groups reinventing collectivism, championing environmental priorities, and the growth agendas. We've had this movement in Germany for quite a while. In England, it's arrived very suddenly and it's expanding very rapidly. Those enclave communities are searching for ethics in the construction process, wishing to know what political systems they help to support, whose money is being invested, and to whose benefit. They want to know the value of what is being built. The new distributed methods of construction offer the potential for communities to own their own means of building and to apply the aesthetic, ideology, and ethics to how, where, and for whom they are building. In terms of tenants, the tenants of modernism, in order to take advantage of this new potential to build in common, architects need to embrace the shift from object focus, which was modernism, to architecture as a system design. Architecture is not a standalone object, it is connected to all the other systems. We need to move from autonomous one-off architectural statements, like the Opera House, to fully contextualized architectural responses, and replace the art of the idea of art into industry with a capacity for localized, bespoke expression. So just to finalize what I'm proposing to you, I propose that it is the industrialized, mass-produced elements of architectural modernism that could be retrieved through disruptive technology to enable grassroots agencies to heal some of the social ills brought about by the flawed execution of modernist ideology of social progress. Direct democracy is the institutional offer, and intergenerational justice is the social utopia. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Irena Bauman, and I would like to invite all the experts back with me here again on stage. I think it's a bit of a challenge to sum up all these different doors you were mentioning, all these different corridors we were looking in. But I think there are some points kind of combine all those different perspectives. I think one is the question of power structures and the concept of modernity. You all kind of mentioned that, and I want to come back to something you said earlier, because it really relates to the pictures we're showing of Carnegie Dwarf right from the beginning in London, this kind of relation between modernity and architecture, and you said it can't be that architects are really conducting change, and you were talking about the HafenCity and its architecture, and I think we are all here, so maybe we can start about thinking a bit about the architecture we are sitting in here today and the question of modernity and how this relates also to the topics of power structures. But that's just a suggestion. If you have something else you want to start with, it's totally fine. And we need a microphone, right?
First of all, it's remarkable to what extent the very place we're in here right now, as an inner city development territory, one of the biggest in Europe, inside the city, from the little I know, brings in all the, I think, all our main topics. That is this immensely powerful colonial prehistory of all the territory we're standing on, literally, due to Hamburg's role in global trade from the 1850s on, at least. Secondly, this is a city, HafenCity is a huge social filter. It is by far the part of Hamburg which has the highest average income. This is a new city built for the rich exclusively. And if you don't believe me, look at the figures. The average income within HafenCity is more than double than Hamburg standard, than Hamburg average, which is remarkable. And certainly it is orthogonalism to an incredible extent. And I would argue that this is a newly built but not a modern district. Because, and this brings me to your talk, it's based on two systems of public transport, an underground line and personal cars, which are by now 130 years old. Though it is surrounded by waterways and one of the densest networks of railway lines extant in Hamburg, which is amazing. This is, as it were, built, planned, and built in the 21st century, a modernist museum, endlessly echoing the sharp edge of the Chile house in brick as an architectural emblem in its newly built, in its new buildings. Plus, it looks like I was thinking about the big four, PricewaterhouseCoopers, etc. They're all around it. In a way, this is modernist office space. This is a dream of modernist office space from the 1970s, and it's amazing. So, how difficult is it to get out of deeply ingrained power structures in the name of the new? That was what I was thinking while I was strolling through the culture this morning. But maybe you have had your own impressions of the place we're in.
It's a pity that Mr. Bruce-Bernstein is not here with us anymore, because it would be quite interesting to have his perspective on the things you mentioned so far. But maybe one of
He hasn't been invited.
I think he had to leave.
I mean, it's a super interesting remark. I'm also very curious about what the others would say about that. I mean, what I see as let's say, in a way, I find this kind of place interesting compared to the way the place where we are, where the Venom Museum is based, in the sense that this is a city that kind of reinvented itself into a kind of a new tech capitalism after Philips left in the 80s, and at the same time it had to kind of really, and that's it kind of in the process of rethinking its social structure, because let's say the old, let's say, corporate modernism on which Eindhoven was based was kind of like a classical industrialist, but a kind of social welfare or social democratic industrialist approach where, let's say, you would have let's say common factory workers would form the majority of the community, But let's say the industrialists would give back to the community by a museum, by a sports club, by all these kind of, let's say, civic institutions. But now with, let's say, modernization now meaning also globalization and meaning also kind of the diversity of cultures, bringing, let's say, a whole kind of different dynamic into a city like Eindhoven, that kind of model, is under an immense pressure. And in a way that you have a kind of a capital elite that flows, let's say, in a different way throughout the world than the, let's say, the old industrialists who would kind of build a lever village and that kind of things. And at the same time, you also have this kind of colonial, like if you are in the West and if you are in the old, let's say, colonial empires of the world, let's say that history, and which has been kept out, especially in the Netherlands, kind of almost hermetically sealed off, like that's out there and we are here, is now, let's say, back at our door and part of the community, and in that sense really kind of complicates and opens up the whole thing of, let's say, what are we talking about when we're talking about modernization? Are we talking about, let's say, more, quicker, faster, bigger, higher, or are we talking about, let's say, better? Are we talking about better? Because if it's talking about better, then, let's say, indigenous knowledge might be much more interesting for us than more, bigger, higher, better. And so that's something that we in Eindhoven, are kind of puzzling with. That, you know, kind of the low, let's say, the tiny architecture, the design focused on individual agency, which maybe doesn't produce, let's say, the massive flow of people. Maybe also it shouldn't, because, let's say, we're flying ourselves to death in a way that we, let's say, increase climate change while we do it. But that in a way, in the end, will result into something that's a different kind of culture. I mean, that will not be no longer modern culture as it was established, let's say, in the Bauhaus period, when modernity got its product designers.
I was really so interested in what you were saying, Steve, about the issues of the changing world as you were designing your museum, because it absolutely it is a fantastic demonstration of what happened when modernity came to an end, because modernity was all about certainty. It was all about rules and structures and hierarchies and management and planning and control and certainty of the future. You actually stumbled over globalization, which is the postmodern condition, where it wasn't modernism that caused it. It was the end of modernism and the beginning of a completely different order. What I think is really interesting is that modernism did create two revolutions, both unpalatable to us. There was Nazism and political responses, and there was communism, and neither of them worked. But underpinning the whole movement was the real belief that society can be improved, that we can create a place where those who are less fortunate can have better living conditions, better work, better lives. And this is what I think could be the legacy that we should be looking to hold on to, because everything that we see around us has no social value ideology behind it. It's pure profit-driven growth, economy-driven, globalized system which ends up enriching a very small number of people. And unless we break that system, everything else is just like shoving textures around the Titanic. So the reason why I'm looking at this movement, which is now so big around the world, of tiny communities making their voices heard, and because of the technologies that we now have, maybe the growth of this movement is not about becoming bigger and more hierarchical. Maybe it is about the network becoming stronger, because we now have an option of networked society which completely bypasses all institutions. And we now borrow money in a different way, we now purchase in a different way, we can now bypass pretty much every organization, every institution was given to us by modernism. So this is why I would look very carefully into very, very small beginnings to start looking for the continuity of modernity, because it will not come from the mainstream.
But as we all know, these small-scale projects, they happen and they are increasing all over the world. But looking at a place like Hamburg, at the HafenCity, for example, it still feels like, Valentin also said, like a dream of 1974 or something. And do you think that this longing for modernity relates to this longing for stability, maybe? And it's not maybe by accident that this kind of architecture all around the world is on large-scale projects up on the first front, because it kind of signifies or tries to signify everything's good, everything's still going on, we're still living the big dream. So maybe, I don't know, it's just a...
I can answer very briefly. I think the dream of stability has transformed itself into a dream of better relation to nature. You know, I think we know that we live that we have excess, that we have more than we need, that those who created modernism are actually the greatest guzzlers of carbon, the greatest creators of a problem. And we are longing for a simpler way of life, and for some of you were saying, you know, looking back to some mythical moment in time when communities existed and people helped each other, and there was room for there was capacity for human kindness and for collaboration. I think this is what we are longing for more now than certainty.
I want to bring in something that seems to me important for the way the HafenCity and similar development territories work, and that is the role of tourism, or the commercialization of urban history. Because what is so amazing is when I walk around here, I stumble over 3 museums, plus a basin where historical ships are moored, a restaurant called Heimat, 150 meters from here, built from scratch, of course, and very orthogonal. And it seems that the configuration of a newly built town quarter cannot do from scratch, but it sort of reinvents itself, echoing familiar models from the 1920s and 1970s. And it's part of the irony of the place, as I see it, that there's a huge museum for the car, Auto Museum, right next to us, and opposite of it is that little showroom, Die kleine Urbanität, small urbanity, and showroom for urban planning, culture, Stadtbaukultur. That's what it's called, and it looks like it looks like an ironic stage. Decoration, in order to bring together all the paradoxes of the place. A place that that simply is built as if tramways or any kind of sustainable public transportation simply wouldn't exist in the 21st century. That's the amazing thing about it. So, if modernity is a promise, and it's a promise for the social good, or for social betterment, as it were, that is, the promise is not aesthetic or economically, but social, then this place is a very strange kind of promise. So if this is the promised land, oh well, whose land is it? And it seems to me for HafenCity could be used that tourism blocks every social and political development on purpose. Whenever you create a place for tourists, for touristic use, it stops change. Or is this too? I was really interested in the way you sketched Eindhoven's and your museum's special role, because you're not in the center of Randstad, that is of the urban, Dutch urbanity and centers, and thus it creates an opportunity from the margins. And that would be my question to I mean, Leeds is another kind of margins than Bogota is, but are there particular opportunities and chances in the margins themselves, because they're sort of underused or underdeveloped touristically?
Undeveloped fully, touristically and locally. I think that's it's a well-known phenomenon, isn't it? That margins produce some marvelous ideas, and partly because they are ecotones. You know, in biology we had the term of ecotone, which is where two different states of nature adjoin each other, like an open field next to a forest. And in ecotone, the most interesting things happen.
So it's an overlap stuff.
Yeah. So it's the same with margins of the city, political margins, whatever margins. And yes, I do feel a certain freedom in Yorkshire, where I live, with the innovators who are there to test things out, to test ideas out, which probably would not be, which just would not be heard in a cacophony of big, major, mainstream cities, where speed is of an essence. But I'm very interested to know.
I was just thinking that many of the remarks I made, they were based on my approach, my historical approach to the understanding of Latin America between 1930s and 1960s. But I have to recognize, to acknowledge that many things have changed. And somehow, I mean, I was thinking about the connection between aesthetic and ideology. And well, I work at the School of Architecture and Design, so it's mostly everything about like making sense out of things and giving order, building orthogonal buildings and planning and stuff. So yeah, I was just thinking about that relationship between ideology and aesthetics, which plays a big role in the connection, for example, with tourism, right? Everything works out around here because everything needs to change and make sense for the tourists. You need to attract tourists, right? So I was wondering what's the turning point, or what's the thing, or what's the catch to it, to make things to things that don't make things sound like a conspiracy theory. As I was thinking about my own speech a few minutes ago, I thought that I think I like the party pooper of capitalism or modernism, and so I have to acknowledge that things have changed in Colombia over the past years, although there are several issues that need to be fixed. But I would say that if design and architecture and art is making sense out of things, making sense of the built environment, and like trying to find some order, whatever the notion of order it is you have, I think things have started, I mean, something's working out. Mm-hmm. And I would say, well, the important thing is not to think about modernity as a discourse, but probably as a dialogue or a reflection, a permanent reflection about your own self, your own society, and how things resonate and don't keep things to like small group or to individuals, but things need to start making sense for more people. So you don't re-marginalize people, you acknowledge like small communities or traditional knowledge. I really loved your examples and also your struggling with ideas about how to present things. I think that would make things so wonderful in this, I mean, nowadays, because we have so many different tools to think about. I mean, we're, thankfully, we're under another paradigm, I think. It's no longer about, you were saying, it's not about being just efficient, it's just about thinking about a different way to think efficiency and productivity, right? It was probably not the right mindset or framework of modernity. It's not the same. It's not the best one to apply to our society nowadays.
But you're all talking about speed, right? You mentioned it, like this concept of modernity is strongly connected to this speeding up things. And this all feels a bit too comfortable for me, like, oh, this is so nice, we have all this coming up from grassroots and so on. And this is, I don't think, I would laugh to think that this is the reality, but I have to admit, I work for the Ministry of Culture now, and I have a very good insight into city planning. And before that, I would have totally agreed with your side, but I think that this is not really happening yet. I think maybe this is a dream we have about the future, but I don't think it is happening yet. But maybe we can just open up this discussion a bit more, and you're strongly invited to come up with questions. Yes, please, Hilke. Do you need a microphone?
I think we're over here.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you very much. Incredibly interesting, the different positions and insights and ideas. I thought it was really important to emphasize the role of colonialism. And staying with your first metaphor, to think of it as kind of like the fuel that nurtured modernity. And then now in the discussion, I was thinking if you're really all talking about the same thing, if it wouldn't be useful or helpful or make sense to think in terms of modernity or about modernity in terms of different things, like it's not one thing and quotation marks. And so maybe from a purely architectural point of view, we could say there's the social aspect in certain architectural movements, but then, I mean, there's also the position of having, or saying that modernity was really a violence, and even that social aspects of giving workers certain rights, etc. You could also interpret, well, that made capitalism work, etc. So, and that connects to a point that I used to work on China, and as you know, in China, Maoism was also an idea of a socialist modernity. And so there's a theory or a certain person who suggests we should talk about modernities, because even if it might have originated philosophically in Europe, exporting it to the colonies, I mean, something happened to this idea, and maybe this generated then also other ideas of modernity. And so just, well, I was going to ask, what do you think about talking about in terms of modernities in Europe?
I think everyone's agreeing here. I think that's a big problem, right? I thought about that last week when I knew I was going to be the moderator of this session next week, that the big problem with modernity is that there is not the one concept, there is not this one narrative, there are so many different layers and concepts and political and aesthetical concepts and so on and so on. I think it's really kind of hard to sum it up, so I think it would be wise to make distinctions.
Yeah, I think you summarize what I was constantly trying to say, which is like the different voices of modernity, like different cases. It's not about, I mean, I think for a long time modernity was about homogenization. And I think that you summarized that up from last week, Catherine, I think, that it was about heterogeneity. I don't know how to say heterogeneity in modernity instead of that homogenization that for a long time we believe it was modernity.
I think the fact that we all come from different disciplines and talking about slightly different things is absolutely responds to the question. But I do think that modernism and modernity do have boundaries that does define it and certain conditions that cause it to happen. The fact that we have had a major war in the West, the fact that there had to be so much rebuilding afterwards, the fact that there were new technologies coming along, the fact that Europe had to rebuild itself, but America was just building itself, so they were very keen to continue with the innovations coming from Europe. So, and then the whole period did come to an end with a number of events which created globalization, released the financial markets, created movement across nations, and the end of the power of a single nation to actually take control over themselves, because what is happening to us all is global, and we don't have global institutions to control what's happening to us. So I think it will be, I was very keen to try and get to the essence of modernism. I started preparing for this because it does exist. And of course there are many slices to it and many disciplines are involved. But I think there is a core idea behind it, which is about progress, about promise of progress, and promise of better society.
I would, in a way, say that, let's say, to frame modernity as modernities would already, in a way, be in conflict with one energy within modernity, if you would say it like that. Because I think, let's say, in a discussion around tourism and let's say, aesthetic modernity, that, let's say, I see a kind of let's say, a conflict there within modern culture, if you will, in the sense that, and I think in a way the reception of Bauhaus is a beautiful illustration of that. So like at that time you had also two museum models lying on the table. You have John Cotadena, who was thinking about the museum as a library, where you could more or less rent works as you would take out books from a library. And you had Benjamin Ives Gilman, who was celebrating the aesthetic approach to, let's say, artworks. And Alfred Barr was really kind of Malcolm in the middle, like really exactly in the middle. He did both. He had library exhibitions that he would send out and that would be exhibited like that, but he also was extremely aesthete and was aestheticizing modernity. And I think, let's say, if you look at who won in, let's say, in Barr's double, let's say, which part of Barr won, I think the aesthetic modernity in that sense won. Even if maybe it won in high culture, like in other technologies, of course it didn't. But if you then see like that the conflict in modernity to me is that, let's say, that aesthetic modernity has, let's say, to me still is linked to that predatory colonial energy that wants to kind of, let's say, control and conserve and maintain and organize everything throughout the same logic. And with the tourist as its kind of perfect avatar, who has no interest and is not invested in the context, but just comes to look at it and say it's beautiful and then leaves again. And there's no real connection to the land. Yeah, like fast. Like,
very fast.
like the Mona Lisa in a selfie, you know? And so I think that let's say, if you look at that kind of duality, like it's, let's say, if you would think about modernities, you would think in a way about the question like what kind of modernity would be appropriate to this location, and then maybe what kind of, let's say, what kind of combination is there to be made out of modern ideas and other kinds of ideas to create your own kind of modernity. But I would say that is already one that stands ideologically apart from the modernity that is linked to tourism and to kind of that kind of form of global trade and standardization and corporate modernity. And it's a conflict. I think it's not a cozy space in that sense.
I actually have some difficulty in linking tourism with modernism.
Because, I mean, the problem with tourism is, for me, that we all like, or most of us probably like to travel and like to discover new places. And that is how all tourism starts. It's just that at a certain moment there's a point where it turns and it becomes. I've been to Barcelona 13 years ago, and I have been 3 years ago. It was. I didn't. Of course, I recognize it, but I did not recognize the population. But I was one of the first to love Barcelona. So how can I blame all the others who want to go there too? And then with modernism is that I think that actually what I perceive as modernist architecture is not very valued in the common population. It's not that they laugh, that they see like this building, this Robin Hood's kind of wasn't quite contested, that the local population wanted to have torn it down because they thought it was ugly, and maybe Le Corbusier where also the locals said, oh, we want to have this torn down, and it was architects who saved the building and it's still used, etc. But I don't have the feeling that tourists are especially linked to modernism. Not in that way, perhaps in the logics of continuation, but not that they actually like modernist architecture. And also a museum lives from tourism in a way. I don't think that just people from Eindhoven, you have you do the postcode thing and
I think that's exactly let's say, when does tourism become part of modernism? When it becomes part of city planning, when it becomes part of city marketing. Like what happened to Amsterdam, what happened to Barcelona in the last 15 years. It's not that by accident everybody started to like Amsterdam. No, it's because we had a huge marketing campaign saying, all come smoke weed in Amsterdam. And then we say, okay, no, come enjoy art in Amsterdam. Like that was a strategy fueled by a market-driven interest. Like this was a way to develop the city. And that's where tourism becomes, I mean, let's say traveling maybe in itself is not modernist. Or let's say maybe
it's been much cheaper since the 1950s.
Yeah, and it also came. That's what I would argue. Like tourism becomes part of that predatory modernity if it becomes part of a city marketing scheme. Because then, in a way, you need to get that kind of neat, tiny. Let's say you need to have a certain kind of place, and you started to hold people accountable for it. Like this is our struggle in the city.
You're surrounded here. You're surrounded. The HafenCity, your place here, the university, is surrounded by international chain hotels. The HafenCity right now is designed for 14,000 inhabitants and 3,000 hotel beds. This is a place designed for tourism. So
I agree with your critique, but I have still difficulty to live with modernity.
You want some pure modernity? You want some pure? Is it for purity you're looking? The purity of a concept?
Maybe the problem is because you mentioned earlier that this district in your opportunity is not modern or a case of modernity at all. It's only newly built, and maybe there lies the distinction between.
Because we're talking about the promise,
yes,
of course. Yeah.
So maybe
it's hard to swallow. It's hard to swallow that the promise of tourism and the promise of modernity stand in so dialectical, theoretically, in so dialectical relationships. Is it that?
I think the link.
I mean, you still.
Perhaps more that in my mindset, I'm always thinking Berger and his postmodernism theory, and their globalization and tourism and all that. What you're talking about is more linked to postmodernism than to modernism. Maybe this, and maybe I also have. I'm not totally clear about when do I think modernism ends. I think it's somehow with the fall of the wall, or some not exactly perhaps, but somehow there. It's probably just my conception, or it's I heard too much Auger.
I would say the modern is, I would use it in a more ethereal way and more intemporal way. The thing about a rupture that has happened over and over throughout history. For instance, there was a rupture or a kind of a modern period that emerged with the discovery of America, or conquest of the New World. And then later on we're talking about, I mean, it's always about destroying or rethinking about the old structures and trying to tearing them down and trying to start anew, like from, I mean, if you read most of the Modernist manifestos, but some ideas also in ancient history is about restarting something from scratch or breaking up with something. So I would propose to use the idea of modernism in that way, or the modern in that way, or modernity. It seems to be like it's a better term, the German term.
Katrina, please.
And
Sorry.
go.
No. No, but did you finish?
Yes, I was going to say something else
Because she
about
was
20th
sitting there for
century,
quite a
but I
while.
forgot.
Like, say something.
I was going to say something about it was also related to your question and the other question. And you go ahead, Catherine. I forgot. I'll pick up later, Vivian.
Okay, well, I think two things. I think we won't get any closer to modernity if we see it in a chronological time, like what is the dernier kind of, or what is the latest. Like a little bit like Stephen, like you mentioned, like the mask, which is more modern because it's younger than the Picasso. I don't know, I'm not sure. And now when you're saying, Irena, like we need some kind of definitions, and maybe it's this promise of progress, which is very ambivalent, and sometimes it's about control and totalitarianism, it's radical, it's also emancipatory, it's all in there, it's very contested. And maybe it's not so much about finding the subject modernity, but it's about the practices and the movements and the breakings, or what you just said, like rethinking. So I don't mean like modernization then, no? But maybe we have to invent something else, like to define this this moment of rethinking something, breaking, like the relation, like you mentioned the relation, like I think Valentin said, like the modernity is something like it's a specific relation to the past. Sometimes you redefine, you take it up again, you mingle it with something, you invent or redefine old figures, inventing new topics. So I just like thinking about this as a practice or something leading to something or to this promise, and maybe not such a thing, or I don't know.
What I argued for is to treat modernity not as a period, but as a rhetorical style, a trope, as it were, a rhetorical figure of self-fashioning, one that's pretty old. That's why I introduced the scholars from the 13th century. Modernity, whenever somebody or something labels itself as modern, and this might be interesting in relation to modernization as well as modernity as well as modernism, it needs push-off points from some past. So it's about setting stark, powerful contrasts.
Or from the present as well? Is present enough, or do you need past?
But look, what they did, I had a very Hamburg example in mind when I wrote that. That is the Speicherstadt. The Speicherstadt was built on two islands that were both full of Renaissance and Baroque houses. 1,100 houses were torn down within 5 years, and 20,000 people were forced out. This was the very point on which the Speicherstadt was built, homogenized, standardized for logistics. The Speicherstadt is very, very modern. It is the exact contemporary of the modern machine gun and of the modern telephone. It is only in Hamburg that the Speicherstadt is seen as some nice, idyllic, good old times.
It has the Baroque facade.
It has neo-medieval facades. It's quite funny for an historian to see the HafenCity incorporating the Speicherstadt again, put up for logistics, again with historicist facades, not only this time from the 20s. That's sort of funny, but maybe it's an endless digestion type cycle of Hamburgensia. Hamburg can't simply, maybe they can't invent, they can't imagine any kind of change. But that's not my...
I won't comment on that.
I don't think it is by chance that this place, a newly built culture, is so packed with museums, as well as a highly super contemporary signature building from international architects as a tourism magnet. And that's why I said modernity is not a period, it's not a style. It's rather a way of self-fashioning.
Becoming like putting oneself in a power position, right? It's also like we are the ones who know how things are to be done. But I was thinking, because you mentioned so many times, like modernity is so strongly connected to efficiency and to speed and to everything in this regard. And I think maybe we should all just leave this concept behind us. Like the whole big bunch, just leave it behind, because this all stands for like only capitalism-driven, blah blah blah, all this stuff you mentioned about this connections, but this is just a thought of mine. So, are there any other questions, remarks from you guys? Yes.
Yeah, it's a bit small, maybe it's a good final question. The question would be like, you have said exactly what you said. Like, do we actually should talk about the new definitions of modernity, or where are we now? The question would be like, what comes afterwards? Because sometimes it feels like the modernity is like the Tina model, like there's no alternative. Everything is modern. everything that is better or faster or more efficient is still modern. What we talk like in our daily life, like fashion is modern, like in architecture, everything is kind of modern. And so maybe it overshadows a lot of processes that come out of, I don't know what. So the question would be like, what do you think?
I think it's
a very simple question, but we have to be, I don't know, it's a good question, but what comes after modernity?
Yeah, and kind of I'm here. No, but it's great that you asked the question, because it allows me to kind of share you my boss's thoughts in a way, because Charles, as the director of the MABE, has a very clear idea about this. And if he would be here, he would talk about one thing alone, and that is that we shouldn't talk about modernity and what's after modernity, but we should talk about demodernizing. Just as we should talk about decolonizing, we should talk about demodernizing. And there should be, just as there is a decoloniality, there should be a demodernity. In the sense that it's not something that you can get out of internet. Maybe that's also why maybe our misunderstanding around tourism existed, because for me, in a way, postmodernism is just another version of modernity in that sense. I don't really see a big rupture there. And that is more a question of ethics. And that's what maybe I also was alluding to, if it's about Bauhaus, is that, I think that's something that maybe quite a few of us share. Is that what I wanted to say is that Bauhaus became, kind of split it up in two things. One is beautiful objects, and the other one is a certain mentality. And I think the mentality is certainly interesting, is certainly worthwhile and interesting. But I think the beautiful objects, maybe, let's say, yeah, they're beautiful, but let's leave it at that. So I think, let's say, the ethics of Bauhaus maybe should be celebrated more than Breuer's chair. Maybe that's my...
What a nice final remark.
I'd like to respond to what you are saying as well, because I feel that we have skipped postmodern state, which actually is incredibly different from modernity in every possible aspect. This is when we lost all the 70s, we lost all the solidity, our environment become very liquid, our predictions for the future are very unclear. We have to make our own path for life without much direction. Managers stop managing. You know in university how much of the management is now self-management. You even have to write your own review of your own performance. So all the kind of strong institutions of modernism are no longer with us if we don't have them. So I think the question, the answer that you gave is a very lovely one, that we might not be progressing in a direct line. Postmodernity stopped that anyway, because we've got so many options now. The postmodern condition is that anything goes. And there's a very interesting essay that I read recently about avant-garde, the movement of avant-garde in art, which could not happen now, because avant-garde was a push against establishment, just as you described. Now there is no such establishment, there are so many different establishments. So I think the biggest disruption that we now have is our relation to nature. It didn't exist, not concern itself with nature. All the essays that I read, all the theory of modernism that I read is always about man relation to another man. It's nothing to do with our environment and the planet. Now this has completely changed. We have to totally review our relationship to nature and the planet and what we're going to still be here in 100 years' time. And I think this is going to drive incredible rate of change. And I sympathize very much with you're sitting in a municipal building, seeing the old structures performing to the usual rhythm, but they are dinosaurs. They cannot continue for much longer. There's no finance for it to continue. There's no capacity. There's no knowledge to know how to cope with all the challenges which are coming. So I think this kind of more networked grassroots civic action will become part of our governance together with the bigger institutions. And this is the kind of near future we can probably look forward to.
I think that's a very optimistic and therefore so nice last word of the evening. Thank you all so much to sticking it up in this heat, and thank you all for your inputs and your discussion. And have a very nice evening here in this touristic district of Hamburg with all its pleasure sites. Have a nice evening and thank you so much.
Delicious.